Your Honor, at this time I would like to request that any remaining time after my closing statement be reserved for rebuttal. May it please the Court? Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, when I spoke to you at the beginning of this trial, I told you that this case would be like a jigsaw puzzle, that you would need a frame and details in order to solve this puzzle. And now at the end of the trial, we've seen all of the evidence, we've looked at the exhibits, we've heard the testimony. I'd like to go through with you those details and show you how they fit into the frame of this puzzle, and hopefully show you a clear and focused picture of what happened on December 7th and who was responsible. Now, I suggested at the beginning of this trial that you would need a frame, and the frame was this: Edward Waldman shot Robert Ramirez in the back. That it was a big picture, something that the defendant admitted doing, and we could work with that as a large idea. But let's go through some of these details. First, you heard from the eyewitnesses. The people that were actually there on December 7th. We heard from Officers Levy and Waldman. We heard Officer Levy's testimony about the altercation involving him and Mr. Ramirez, and how Mr. Ramirez allegedly pulled a knife. You heard from Officer Edward Waldman of his fear for his partner and his immediate discharge of his weapon, shooting my client, who had been engaged in a hand-to-hand fight with the other officer. And lastly, you heard from my client, Robert Ramirez. And you heard Mr. Ramirez testify of the circumstances that he now faces after the incident on December 7th. His wife has since passed away, and he no longer has his same job. He's been delegated to a desk job because the injury that he sustained from the gunshot wound has so hampered his physical ability to perform labor that he can no longer function on a daily basis on a drywall, sheetrocking industry. He sits at a desk. But in addition to those eyewitnesses, you heard from experts, Doctors Angrist and Marshall. Now, Dr. Marshall is a qualified physician. Dr. Marshall was the physician who examined Mr. Ramirez on December 7th. He made observations, jotted down notes, formed official opinions and records. During the course of Dr. Angrist's investigation, interviews with Mr. Ramirez, she obtained those records from the hospital, reviewed them, and then went a step further and interviewed my client. Dr. Angrist is the only expert to actually question my client or the police officers about what happened on December 7th. And after reviewing all of the medical records and interviewing my client, Dr. Angrist found the stories to be consistent. Now, the defense counsel will come up in a minute and they will talk to you about the burden of proof. They will say that we have to prove our case, and if we can't make our case, you can't vote for us. And they're exactly right. But unlike a criminal trial, all we have to show is that it is more likely than not that something took place. This is not beyond a reasonable doubt or a preponderance of the evidence or 99% sure. It's more likely than not. It's 51-49. Dr. Angrist is the only expert, as I said, who actually interviewed the individuals who were there, and she thinks the stories are consistent, that it is more likely than not. You heard from Officer Edward Waldman about the Chicago Police Department policy involving the use of deadly force. You heard Officer Waldman read from that policy and read how it is the use of deadly force is a last resort measure and should only be used or implemented when all other means have been exhausted and failed. And these included, but were not limited to, a verbal warning, a chase if a suspect was fleeing, or a warning shot. On cross-examination, Officer Waldman admitted he did not issue a verbal warning, and he did not fire a warning shot. fact, he did nothing but get out of his car before he shot my client in the back. Officer Waldman claims that his use of force was justified because my client had a knife. And there are a number of circumstances involved about this knife. Where the knife was found, the mechanism of the knife. This knife, a locking blade. For this knife to close requires 2 hands. It cannot be closed by dropping. It cannot be closed with 2 fingers. It requires intent to close this knife. And the piece of the puzzle with the knife does not fit. What does fit is the forensic analysis of this knife. There was no fingerprints belonging to my client on this knife. If the defense witnesses are correct and state that my client had a knife in his hand, this knife raised above his hand, raised above his head to stab Officer Levy, at which point he was shot, he fell to the ground and dropped the knife. It would be impossible for him, 1, to close the knife, but 2, not to leave fingerprints on the knife. And there were no fingerprints found on the knife belonging to my client. There was no blood on the knife belonging to my client or to Officer Levy. No blood at all. No forensic evidence whatsoever linking this knife to my client. My client admitted on the witness stand he did not own this knife, he does not own this knife, and he did not use this knife to stab Officer Levy. So we have our frame, and Officer Waldman shot Robert Ramirez in the back. We have seen the eyewitness testimony, the expert testimony, the forensic evidence, and the police policy. These 4 details complete this puzzle and show a clear picture of what happened on December 7th. Mr. Ramirez claims that Officer Waldman's actions were reckless and negligent, and we ask you to return a verdict in my client's favor. Thank you.